most prevalent feature of transgender people in the LGBTQ community is their presence in the acronym. They think it's high time for a split. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be proving this to you through our case, in which I will be dealing with why an umbrella movement significantly paralyzes the ability for the transgender movement to be able to actualize its aims and empower its own people. But secondly, why we think that it's significantly important and why a separation will empower transgender voices and transgender autonomy. My second speaker, William, will be dealing with why you create better social discourse between transgender people and the rest of society and why this is better for society as a whole. But before we do that, let's move on to some important context. Firstly, what is our policy and what is separation going to entail? It's going to entail three main aspects of separation. Firstly, there's going to be a distinction in ideology. This means that it's going to have its own aims and values which we think are legitimate. Secondly, it's going to have its own organization. This means that the power structures and hierarchies within the LGBTQ movement are decided by the power structures and hierarchies within the transgender movement are decided by transgender people. Thirdly, we think in practice there's going to be a significant distinction between how the LGBTQ movement practices its movements and how the transgender community movement practices its movement. Now let's make our stance very clear, right? Because we are happy with allies being involved in the practice of these movements. We are happy with the coalition of the LGBTQ movement and the transgender movement when it comes to execution. We are not okay with any sort of interference when it comes to the other two aspects. Secondly, in context, we think that their goals and aims are just opposite in nature. Firstly, why? Because we think that transgender people have their presentation openly discussed or openly prevalent in society. There is no veil that you can hide behind as similar to a gay person because it is always there to see, because gender is something that is always physical, you can always see it, you cannot take it. Secondly, we think that this legislatively has been more rights for gay people than there has been for transgender people. Now what all this means is that transgender people suffer significantly worse oppression and significantly more intolerable oppression than most members of the LGBTQ community. We think that by this nature, we think that their goals and their aims should significantly be opposite because we think they have more need for change. We think that's significant. Third point of context, we think that historically there has been a significant amount of disparity in the power that the LGBTQ movement have over transgender people. We think that firstly, gay people have had significant changes in how society perceives them. They've had significant changes in legislation that protects them, and all transgender people have got are Caitlyn Jenner and Barnato, right? We think that's significantly harmful. We think that's something that needs to change. But now let's move on to my substantive matter, and before that I'm happy to take a POI. No, okay. So let's move on to substantive matters, right? So this is firstly going to be dealing with why we think that an umbrella movement paralyzes the voices and the aims of transgender people within that movement. Firstly, we think there's a lack of recognition of positionality. We think that gays believe that they have some sort of power over that movement, and they believe that they have a shared community that has shared ideals because they were the first movers, right? We think that in most instances, historically, the LGBTQ plus movement was the movement that was firstly originated, and therefore they have first movers advantage, which means they have significantly more capital in terms of social influence and in terms of what kind of legislative change they can create. I'll take you in a moment. But most importantly, when we make the actual comparison, we think that when gay people and other members of the LGBTQ movement believe this, they think it's okay to prioritize their oppression over the oppression of their subgroup. We think that's specifically harmful. Secondly, we think there's been a long history of resource sidelining by the LGBTQ movement. Because firstly, there's been a power vacuum created due to this advantage of first movers, and we think that's significantly harmful. But secondly, we think that gay, white, privileged males, the intersectionally privileged, believe they should have representation that should trump the representation of the transgender movement. We think this is harmful. Thirdly, we think there just has been structural oppression, which means that you, as a transgender person, are less likely to go against this movement because this movement has a veneer of legitimacy that's significantly powerful, because there has never been significant criticism of the LGBTQ movement because they're seen as the upholders of power and freedom for the people. This is specifically important because it's having their own movement means they can criticize them more openly. And before more to my next argument, I'm ready to give you one.
So the harm only exists if you can actually prove to us that the LGBT trumps the benefits that they get are not exclusive to only LGBTQ people and not transgenders. If you're gonna concede that they have more bargaining power and more capital, wouldn't it be better for the transgender community to be under this power, at least in the present?
The reason why that doesn't happen is because we told you in our context there isn't a trickle down of power and influence, right? Because what happens is because they are so neglected, they are never able to reap the benefits of whatever the LGBTQ movement achieves. Having their own movements at the very least gives them some sort of representation in the physical eye of society. But what is our solution, right? Because our solution does two main things. Firstly, it removes all the harms that I've talked to you about earlier in my speech. Secondly, you empower transgender radicalism because they are able to create their own movement, and when this exists within its own movement, it is most effective. Why? Because firstly, socially, they are able to fight for rights for transgender people vividly in a way that society cannot ignore them because they are under the umbrella of another movement. When they have their own separate movement, it means that it's very difficult for you to ignore that movement because it's vivid, it is clear, it is there. Secondly, you have a greater ability to be able to criticize society's solutions to transgender people. They are able to criticize the fact that Caitlyn Jenner is seen as the reason why transgender people are gaining freedom in society, are gaining social acceptance. They are able to take control of what society proposes as solutions to their disempowerment. But secondly, we think that you empower autonomy for transgender people, and this is specifically important, right? Because what we're going to tell you is that it's specifically important in terms of autonomy because these transgender people have been significantly determined in the amount of autonomy that they have within the LGBTQ movement. When they have their own movement, they're able to make decisions such as how should resources be allocated so that we can best represent our aims and our ideals. And now we're going to go into the important bit of analysis, which will tell you that even if nothing happens and no change happens at all, we at the very least, create a safe space for transgender people to be able to accumulate their identities, and we think that even if this isn't true, it is principally justified to be able to grant people their own views of how they want their disempowerment to be empowered. We think this is principally justified. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a change in the way that the LGBTQ movement is viewed, and it's time for the change in the way that transgender people are viewed.
Problem number one with rhetoric speech. If it's going to tell us that these people are never ever heard, which we do not even think is true, but even if assuming but not that they were, how do they then propose to us mechanistically that they do get heard after they separate themselves? Because if you're willing to concede that the majority of the capital exists within the LGBTQ movement, if you're willing to concede that the LGBTQ movement can trump them and sideline their voices altogether, what makes you think it becomes any different once they're separate and they're seen as the other? Ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that when we're talking about minority groups, power in numbers is what is important, and that's what they disregard. So it's very simply our clash is the struggles of minorities ought to not be divided, especially when the benefits are for all. Because when we tell you such things such as legislating gay rights are not only specifically to homosexuals, but also inclusive of transgenders, so that benefit is inclusive, and at this present moment, we deem that to be the better alternative of what they suggest, right? So then, what we'll be showing you this to the following case. Either first tell you why there is a direct correlation between these movements and thus they ought to not separate. My second speaker correlation deals with how them being together can be better in terms of future progression, and how them being together and how they ought, if they ever to separate, it shouldn't even be now. It's maybe sometime later in the future, right? But before all of that, a few points of rebuttal. So here I have basically two main things to flag out, and the rest will be in my actual substantive, right? So first, the rhetoric tells us that these people are at opposite ends of the spectrum, right? We state that this is not true, because his only discussion here is that what transgenders can't hide that they're transgender, but gay people can. So that is especially problematic when you firstly consider that gay people do not want to hide themselves, and that's the reality, right? But then secondly, whether or not people can hide themselves, what we need to do is create a space whereby both these people can express themselves properly without any fear, and therefore they're not at the opposite spectrum, because ultimately they want to campaign to be able to out themselves and to come out without fearing any backlash. But then secondly, it tells us that there's more legislation and protection for LGBTQ people and all transgenders are transgenders. So that the fact Caitlyn Jenner, right? So the fact that Caitlyn Jenner can be so influential within our media in itself is a benefit towards the transgender people, which comes from their coalition with the LGBTQ plus movement, and that is essential for their progression. But then secondly, we say that bigger than that, gay rights are inclusive of all other people within that spectrum. We don't think that's true, right? But then lastly, if it's going to tell us about power dynamics, we first need to ask why do they think they're better on their side, because they've given us no proof of that. But then secondly, so that if you can tell us that there would be side that in status quo, but they're together and campaign together, that they're still sidelined, we feel like it's worse on your end when they're the other, and they have to fight for the same media coverage, they have to fight for the same course systems, etc. They perpetuate the harm they present to us, if it is true, right? So now going on to our side of this debate as opposition, we have a question of criteria, and that is when we distinguish ourselves. So here I would say that we distinguish ourselves for three reasons, right? Firstly, when we seek more recognition than what we have in presence, but secondly, once we are guaranteed to have that after being separate, right? Secondly, when currently there is a difference and mutual exclusivity that exists within us campaigning together, but thirdly, when this coexistence presents a very significant harm to either one or both of the parties. We don't think this applies in any instance. So for instance, when we talk about black people and Indian under apartheid campaigning together, because they had a common oppressor, and we show you why this is important later on, right? But then also we need to understand in terms of context what a binary actually is, right? Not now, Daniel. The problem is that with binaries that they are assigned at birth, and just when you are born and then society expects you to act a certain way from that. The purpose of both these movements are for them to change this mindset around binaries and how people have certain expectations of them. We feel that once their goal is common in that respect, they're all campaign together, particularly right now. But also we need to understand the context of their past and present, and not now, the both of you, right? What this means that in the past, both were discriminated, sit down, Redfig, both were discriminated because of the differing from the societal norms, right? But in present, that both of them are getting acknowledgement together from campaigning together. Why is this so? So that when in competitions such as this, we no longer assume that people, simply because they are male, want to be identified as sir, and we're going to respond to them as first speaker or by their name if we know that. So that this is a clear example of how progression is already happening, and acknowledgement is occurring within society right now, right? And still right now. But then lastly, we understand what is a movement. And here we tell you there are three things that a movement actually seeks, right? Firstly, is to seek the end goals that are based on its principles. I'm very sure why their principles are the same. But then secondly, it seeks achievement. And this can be some sort of legislation or so forth. Gay rights, gay marriage is a thing. We feel that is inclusive. But then thirdly, we say that when they seek the recognition of the present people who are going through that struggle, right? What this then means that they need to achieve their aim in the quickest way possible, so that people right now who are experiencing the struggle and the oppression get recognized. And we see that this happens mostly when you have numbers to back you up and more people to gain attention from the government quickly, Daniel.
On your criteria of individualism, the Indian people and black people were able to cooperate under apartheid at the same time that Biko was able to lead his black consciousness movement. Why are they mutually exclusive when we choose to distinguish ourselves as individuals?
The reason for that not being applicable in this instance is that once they are separated, as already considered, there's a lack of capital that exists, right? But in fact, even with Steve Biko being black conscious, it has the same principle of propelling equality for the masses, but and being specific in that regard, we don't think that happens, right? But now let's go on to what is a direct correlation from these people. Given that historically they both had the same struggle, and now they come to the same common oppressor and face the same type of backlash from society of being assigned and asserted a certain binary and expected to conform to that at birth, they both seek to eradicate this, right? They were founded together and they were founded on the same principles historically, and thus they need to campaign together. But then secondly, in terms of ideology, we said that simply because we are different, but simply because we may have different perceptions on a struggle, that doesn't mean that we ought to campaign separately. So you look at feminism as an idea, where we have eco-feminists, we have Afro-feminists, and we have feminazis, right? What this then means that they still fall under the idea of feminism together, and they still campaign together for the benefits of one and the benefits of all. It is better to seek a recognition of the greater agenda, and then we can try to separate ourselves, right? But then last, we need to understand that there is an inability to dispute themselves, because once they dispute amongst themselves, what this then means is that they go against the very same principle that they were founded on, right? So and this is specifically massively harmful because it means that, and it is important for them to not crack it because it means that the majority and the biggest cannot point at them and say, if you guys can differentiate yourselves, what's wrong with us doing the same? If you guys can discriminate amongst yourselves internally, what's wrong with us doing the same? Such proposition validates the biggest within society. Such proposition wants minorities to focus on their differences and for their gains today.
Hello, my leader. Is that fine?
Do not be mistaken. In oppression politics, there is no united league of the oppressed. We need to acknowledge that at the moment in the fight for racial equality, the voices of black women are being drowned out by black men. We need to acknowledge that in the fight for gender equality, the voices of black women are being drowned by the voices of privileged white women. We say that there was a point in time in history where it was important for us to rally together, where it was important for us to use our collective numbers to fight against the bigger oppression. But that isn't the moment now. Now is the moment in which words such as intersectionality become important in our society, in which we need to recognize these words and allow these movements to go on separate paths and to flourish separately. At my point, I'm going to show you why we encourage better social engagement, why that is much greater in terms of getting normalization and acceptance. But before I do that, some rebuttal. Firstly, in terms of context, we've already shown you through my introduction that it was important in some periods of time, for example, for all people of color, black, Indian, Arabic, to fight against apartheid. But at the moment, for example, what things such as Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall have shown us is that we need to recognize the different privileges that exist between Indians in South Africa, between blacks in South Africa. We say that is a shift that needs to happen now. But secondly, we say that historically, yes, we say belonging to one big umbrella movement was valuable and that it gave these specific people, these trans groups, immediate exposure to the rest of society and they could piggyback off existing capital. It's because of that that we think that any kind of separation isn't going to significantly cut off resources, but most importantly allow them to direct resources for their own specific goals and aims. But secondly, strategically, what we need to realize is that they've already lost, because Riffic had an entire point of substantive matter which told you that regardless of the outcomes, whether or not this is effective in actually getting change, it's just important in recognizing the agency of the trans groups in the LGBT movement to give them their own safe space, their own community, and that was unresponded to, they need to respond to in order that they want to win.
Well,
so let's deal with what they told us. Eric firstly told us that there's a direct correlation in terms of the goals of the movement, that they have unified intentions such as trying to break down social binaries in society. We won't remove that. We say in periods in which they have the same goals and intentions, they can collaborate on those issues. Riffic told in his speech that in practice, we can allow for allies to try and assist each other in achieving those goals and aims. And it's exactly what happened during the Fees Must Fall movement, in which we allowed white people to be present during the protests, but we didn't allow them to sit in Senate House planning how exactly those protests would happen. But they need to accept nuance, right? Because what we told you here is that these two different movements are at different periods historically, right? The LGBT movement has already fought for legislative equality. They've gotten marriage equality, they've gotten acceptance to the workplace, and they've gotten affirmative action policies that means that they can have an active presence in politics, in the media. This isn't the case for the trans movement. They're still fighting to have bathrooms, right? We say that in that instance, it's important to recognize that the separate fight for legislative equality from the LGBT movement and the fight for substantive equality from the LGBT movement, vice versa, is important and they're irreconcilable. The next thing they tell us here is that how are these groups ever likely to succeed if they don't have the capital and if they don't have the resources? That was one half of our argument. Let's do the comparative. What we told you is that at the moment, the reason why the issues of LGBT people are prioritized is because they are the biggest funders, right? They are the leaders, they set the agenda, and in many cases, they choose how that movement is going to transpire. Meaning that even in that instance, the issues and voices of trans people aren't looked after to begin with. If we do the comparative under our model, where they exist as separate and distinct movements, we see that it's much easier for them to call out these individuals for not supporting them, to say, as our allies, you're supposed to help us in these specific instances, you're supposed to give us some money, but beyond that, we think that they do have enough resources to sustain themselves. But importantly, like Rufik told you, it's important for them to build those organizations to begin with, to build those institutions, to develop that culture of looking after themselves, which means that over time, this policy addresses itself and is solved, and we don't lose out on that benefit to begin with, right? So, I'm going to be integrating the rest of my responses, which deals directly with how we deal with bigots in our society. So, why do we improve wider social engagement, right? What Eric tells us in his speech, that what this sets a precedent to, is it says to bigots that if you guys are discriminating amongst yourselves, then it's okay for us to discriminate against you. We firstly think that logical reasoning doesn't follow as to how that causally results in bigots reacting in that way, but most importantly, the premise of discrimination against these groups to begin with is that all of their issues are conflated, right? Think about it, right? A lot of people believe that if you're gay, you're more feminine, failing to realize that that's an issue of intersectionality and it's a separate issue independent of sexuality. What we allow for is we allow for these movements to recognize the intersectional struggles that these groups face, to realize that there's nuance and that there are different periods of time. Under a collective umbrella, we conflate the issues that they are fighting for. And this is damaging, right? What we tell you, for example, is that in 2015, after marriage equality was achieved in June, in December in Texas, when people were trying to fight for the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance to get bathrooms for transgender people, Texas legislature says, we're not going to give you bathrooms, we've already given you marriage equality. The problem there is that it gives the perception that their issues have already been solved. There is nothing more for the rest of society to do to address them. That is something that we don't want to encourage on our side. But most importantly, it's just important to recognize nuances. Just like it's equally important to recognize that the struggles that black women face in terms of having to deal with racism and sexism is something that is different to the struggles that black men face. And even if we don't get huge societal benefit, we still get the marginal benefit of people being considerate of their struggles and understanding the nuances that exist there. That's a good thing. Secondly, why do we get normalization through media representation? We say that the reason why, this is where you misunderstood Rick's nuance, the reason why trans issues are more controversial relatively and comparatively to LGBT issues is that it's in the public, right? It's about gender performance, how you dress, which bathrooms you want to use. And to many people, that is something that is more discomforting than whether or not someone, the sexuality that someone chooses, because that has nothing to do, whereas you're going to be using the same bathrooms. This is the rhetoric and logic that is used by people in Texas. We say the only way we can change that is by allowing for these groups to be independent. And when they're independent, we get more representation in the media. Because now it's no longer defensible for Hollywood companies and movies to say, we already have a filled-out gay quota, we already have the gay character, there's no need for us to have another trans one. That is something that we need to encourage, and that can only happen when they're recognized as independent and separate movements. But thirdly, we encourage cross-movement critique. We allow these movements to openly criticize each other for their shortcomings, recognizing the fact that there's huge transphobia in the gay community, and that's something that actively needs to be called out and can only happen when they're not an amalgamated umbrella movement. Ladies and gentlemen, we protect the rights of trans individuals, but most importantly, empower them and recognize their autonomy. I'm proud to propose.
As much as it is not fine to avoid transgenders, we tell you that it is not fine for Will to avoid Eric's first speech. And here's where we essentially tell you that the problem with proposition in today's debate is firstly they want to run away from arguing about efficacy and how this will actually make that movement gain that recognition, but on a second level, how the ideas of the foundation of where these parties or where these movements come from stem from the same place. We tell you that a tree gets its roots from the same place, and even if it divides when it reaches the top, the very foundation that it stands under still applies in today's debate, and we tell you that this is this very movement, right? So today's debate, let me first go into my rebuttals, right? And here we look at the ideas of what we're told from proposition. So the first thing we hear from proposition in today's debate is that transgenders are not recognized at all. We tell you that this is false. We tell you that the ideas of even giving transgenders bathrooms is what is prevalent in America at the moment. We tell you that after gay rights, as much as we gave gay rights, as much as we gave gay people the idea to get married with each other, we now moved on to the next agenda as one big movement. We tell you that this applies within this very movement. We tell you that even if we start with the gay people, at the end of the day, the transgenders will still get their toilets. This is an idea that we love and value in today's debate. But furthermore, they give us this idea, and this comes up in Dance PLI, of Black consciousness movement and how there was a different movement at that time. What we tell you is that a key example, and why we do not actually want different movements, is when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King stood for different things. What happened to Malcolm X and his Black consciousness ideas? These ideas were not even looked at. These ideas are not even taught that much in history. They are not even noticed. Furthermore, what we tell you is that what then strives is Martin Luther King, and the person that we recognize most is Martin Luther King. We tell you that this is the very same thing which would happen to transgender people. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, what we then told you is the idea of organizations and how organizations work, and this is where Eric's speech needed to be listened to, right? We tell you when you enter within an organization, you want the progression of that organization, and you want to meet the same end goals. So this means when you see that there's a progression within these very organizations, and we see that they are reaching some form of equality within this very state, although it's not even perfect at the moment, but since there is that progression, you stay within that organization because it is working. Yes, it might not be working at this utmost, but we tell you that it is even better to fight within that organization, to tell the gay straight man that, look, I am fighting for the same thing you are fighting for. Recognize me, because if you do not recognize me, you lose your power also. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that these ideas of gay rights, these ideas of LGBTQIA+, are global idea. So this means that just because America might get its gay rights, we still need to look at Uganda. This means that we do not break apart this whole movement because we think we've reached that point where we can do so. We tell you that we are still at a point where we need to do it not only for one nation, but for all nations. And we tell you when we get to the point where the movement in itself is recognized globally, then we can think of separating movements. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that and they give us this idea of correlation and how we can just work together even though we have different movements. We tell you that this is just not true. We tell you that what they do is say that transgender people, or the perception that they create, is that transgender people leave the LGBTQI+ movement because they hate it or because they have banter towards it. This means that the coalition does not exist because what you actively do is say, I will not be part of you in the first place. I do not want to be associated with you. So what you then create is movements that would never work together because these movements understand that you do not care about me as much as I do not care about you. This is what you create in today's debate. So let me move on to my positive matter, and yes, then I'll take it now.
Women can be members of the feminist community and also be members of the Black Lives Matter community, even though the majority of the leaders of Black Lives Matter have been known for misogyny. You can't pull out mutual exclusivity unless you're able to work out intersectionality.
We tell you that there is no problem with me being part of a movement and me identifying in a certain way. We tell you that there is no problem with me being female and me saying that, well, if anything, let me bring the feminist movement within the Black consciousness movement. Let me say that the Black consciousness movement should have the feminist movement within itself, should preach the same principles, because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking for equality. This is the line that we draw in today's debate. We tell you that there is no problem with this. So then let me analyze one question in today's debate. And this is why should both parties or movements work together. And I'll be looking at 5 main points. So firstly, under the idea of a voice, right? We tell you that a voice is there when you are actually working together. This is Eric's analysis on organizations. We tell you that the voice is there when we recognize these people need rights. We tell you that for us to recognize that transgenders are not being treated in an equal manner, it is because they speak within that very movement. We tell you that it is easier for you to speak within a movement that stands for something, and you being able to call them out and say, look, what you are doing is not going towards what this movement stands for. What you are doing is not what this movement even had planned for at the beginning. So you can't even call yourself part of this movement if you do not believe in not having what is this discrimination against different binaries, against different people. We tell you that the problem is within individuals within the movement and not the movement in itself. itself. But furthermore, we tell you that why not today, right? And the idea here is that today is not the good day to do this, right? And here what we tell you that the progressive state in which these movements are on needs to be upheld. We cannot disturb the progression that these movements are undergoing, and we need to value this in today's debate. But on the second level, when we divide these parties at this present moment, we then create a society which devalues all that this movement has done at the moment, because we are saying that all that this movement had at the beginning is devalued. COPE, ladies and gentlemen, COPE was a party which tried to make it on their own, but because of a divide within their very system, the party was diluted, the party stopped progressing. We tell you that this is the very same thing that will happen to this movement. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, on the third level, we tell you we then favor one above the other. We tell you that media coverage then focuses on one person. And if all the analysis is true on how transgenders are looked down upon, we tell you it is worse when a gay man has more influence and tells you that, look, these people left my group, they left my household, so don't even bat an eye, don't even look at them, their struggles are irrelevant in today's debate. But furthermore, the perceptions that we then get are these bigotry ideas within the movement themselves. We are saying that a transgender person is a bigot because they look at somebody different because they are gay. This is the idea that goes against their very founding principles. And we tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, we value a side that recognizes everything.
Is this good? The idea that opposing homophobia inherently means opposition to transphobia is not only the reason that transgender people have been erased and vilified within the gay community for the last 35 years, but is also the reason that the opposition will be losing today's debate. Because the fatal assertion that they're going to make in today's debate, and have evidently made, is one that says that the ability to be part of a gay community inherently means that you are accepted, tolerated, and seen as equal. We can look at history, we can look at current legislation, we can look at the erasure of transgender characters, even in movies centered around gay characters, such as the Stonewall riots, to prove to you that this will always happen when they are not separate and when they are not empowered to speak out. Two questions I need to ask in today's debate. Firstly, which side allows for the most accurate representation of transgender voices? Secondly, which side allows for the most amount of social engagement and discourse? But before that, let's understand two things about the opposition. Firstly, the nature of today's debate is a debate about margins. No side is going to argue that without the gay community, transgenders would be killed, at the same time as arguing that in the circumstance when we have the gay community, transgenders have the best possible outcome. This is a debate about the margins, not the extremes. So what that means is we need to look at the way that the margins affect each individual person. And that becomes particularly important when I get to my clashes, right? But secondly, let's ask what this policy actually means. Because at no point in this debate, in our context or in the motion, does it state that by removing yourself from the gay community, you actively have to vilify gay people. Instead, you actively had to remove yourself in the same way that the gay community has actively removed you from their aims and objectives over the last 35 years. This isn't a debate about removing yourself from the community. This is a debate about making yourself distinct within the community. We can be the tree with the same roots as long as our branches are distinct. So, how do we allow for the most accurate representation of transgender voices? We got two points of analysis from the opposition. The first thing that we got told is that albeit that there might be a specific principled value that may or may not come, we have to prioritize resources, right? Well, firstly, no, we don't evaluate things such as human rights on a utility calculus. Try not to be robots, right? But secondly, we've given you 2 points of context that prove to you that even if we want to prioritize resources, we don't get them in the LGBTQ plus movement, right? Firstly, there's very little trickle down. Secondly, we've also told you that the rich, white, gay man is more likely to feel that his needs need to be prioritized because he's contributing the most amount of social and economic capital. There was no response to any of this analysis, and that's particularly important if you're going to want to prioritize resources. But let's give you 3 more responses, right? We would firstly gladly accept any financial or social contribution that comes from the gay community. We told you in our policy that we're very happy to accept any contribution in practice, right? In the same way that white people can join the Black Lives Matter marches, not forums, right? Sit down, right? But secondly, we never deal with efficacy when we're talking about human rights, specifically because we would always value a safe space over a violent erasure that leads to some form of change Possibly, right? Because at the very least in our policy, analysis William gave you, that was never dealt with, we allow for the creation of safe spaces that specifically creates safer discourse and more insular ability to look after your own autonomy before you're forced to engage with the outside world. If we care about resources, we care about the proposition. The second thing that we get told by the opposition is this idea that people in the gay community inherently share an identity, be them transgenders or be them homosexuals, right? Well, firstly, we would say maybe 50 years ago, but definitely not anymore, because there's been a significant disparity in the development. This is more stuff that we told you that was never engaged with. But secondly, that's just downright offensive to try to assert that the different individual lived experiences that are experienced by transgender and gay people are inherently the same, and as a result, we have to treat them the same, especially when we're seeing different structural engagement with those two people, right? But finally, we could argue that a multitudinous amount of views means that even if they do share an identity, you don't remove that shared identity when you move them into different movements, right? This is why we're able to have black consciousness at the same time as a multiracial Nelson Mandela. What's particularly important about that is, at the very least, if this separation of a movement means that we allow for safe spaces and actual autonomy, we can still support it regardless of whether or not they share an identity, right? So, what did we tell you as the proposition? We firstly told you that an umbrella movement is inherently paralyzing to transgender bodies. And this is where the opposition had to actively explain why putting yourself in a movement where you make up about 2% of the people, 1% of the financial capital contribution, and about 3% of social exposure is actually going to allow you to not be paralyzed. You will always take into consideration the views of other people. You will always be silenced. You will always be forced to take into consideration rich gains, right? But secondly, we told you, if you want us to deal with efficacy, I'll take you in a second. If you want us to deal with efficacy, deal with Ridley's point that told you that you empower transgender radicalism when you don't have to appease gay voices on top of straight voices. Instead, you're now able to speak out in more extreme social ways and able to call out issues in the transgender community itself because you don't have to appease a bunch of people who don't know your life story. Because of that, we will always prioritize the ability for transgender individuals to be separate. Yes?
You don't deal with the fact that you are 2% in the large group, but it's 0.2% in the whole society, and therefore you feel that those people then get the recognition that they deserve when they don't even make an impact there.
That POI might have made sense if I didn't just tell you why something like transgender radicalism is particularly more effective. Because the ability to make social outbursts, to have more exposure proportional to the size of your group, and the ability to create a safe space that accurately represents who you are as an individual, instead of appeasing to gay individuals, will always allow you to have your voice heard because you aren't appeasing others before you even get to the fight. So, do we allow for better social engagement? What is this fight, right? One point of analysis that we get given from the opposition, and they tell us that this allows bigots to further assimilate people and separate them because now they see divisions within the own community. If that were true, things like calling out sexism in the Black Lives Matter movement would be the wrong thing to do. If that were true, calling out racism in the feminist movement would also be the wrong thing to do because divisions inherently empower bigots. Instead, what we would argue is those divisions empower the ability for oppressed intersectional minorities to have their voices heard and to create constructive discourse. That doesn't happen when there are oppressed intersectional minorities within the transgender community, within a transgender community that in itself is an oppressed intersectional minority. Because of that, we would always hold them separate. Those were my new responses. But what did we tell you as a proposition? We firstly told you that you recognize intersectional differences and accommodate to them better. No response. We secondly told you that you normalize the media and you allow people to call out the difference between a gay quota and a transgender quota. No response. But we finally told you that we allow for mutual critique of both movements, allowing for better engagement altogether. No response. Because I know that homophobia and transphobia are two completely different issues and shouldn't be addressed the same.
So everything that side proposition tells us about transgender groups once they distinguish themselves parts of the LGBTIQ plus movement, assuming but not conceding they actually do become a success, still hinge on the fact that the common oppressor that these minorities are trying to fight against even wants to recognize you not only in a big group, but wants to then also recognize you when you decide to remove yourself from that big group that they're already trying to recognize, and you become an entity that they can't even start to even look at within society. We think that this is the problem that we have within today's debate, and side proposition does not acknowledge this, and we want them to actually do that, but I think it's probably late, right? But here I have two main issues of contention, and the first one is how we actually ensure the progression of movements to even begin with, but secondly, how we then grant recognition to the very same individuals that are even part of these movements, right? But before I get into any of that, let us look at this strategic flaw that we actually get from side proposition. So the first thing that they tell us here is that when we separate these people, they become more vivid. They give us no mechanistic analysis of how we even get these oppressors to even recognize these people now that they're even out of this bigger group that they don't even want to recognize to even begin with, right? They needed to prove to us that this transgender group, once it's out of the LGBTQI plus movement, it then has the power to make masses aware of it when it doesn't even do that within this LGBTIQ movement to even begin with, when we assume the policy that they give to us, right? We acknowledge that because this LGBTQI movement is an enormous movement that is gaining recognition to even begin with. The gay laws and finding people gay rights may be what is the priority in this instance. It means that once they've dealt with that, which they're still doing, they can then also move on to the other minorities that are within this group, so that they also provide widespread benefits and not just only focus on gay people, because that's not what the movement actually stands for, right? We tell you here that when they also concede the fact that this LGBTQI movement is actually big enough that it actually gets these people these kind of rights, they then do not deal with the fact, which is something that Eric tells them, that when we then allow for this one small group to then remove themselves from this kind of group, there's going to be a trump of the small group by this LGBTI movement that is already gaining this recognition that they have, right? We tell you that it's so much better for people to be aware of the LGBTI movement and then realize that there's different groups within the LGBTI movement that they also need to recognize. When we do not allow for people to even, when we don't even allow for people to acknowledge this kind of group, how do we then allow for them to acknowledge another group that is going to be even smaller than what we want them to acknowledge and won't even guarantee the success of the small one, right? We tell you here that the interest is their interests are best served when they're part of a group that has proven to work and that can actually be a group that they can hold accountable if it does not speak to the struggles that they're fighting for, right? Because we realize that we cannot have this distinction that bigots already established when they become bigots in society. Because of this arbitrary distinction that we already have, that bigots use as a platform of discrimination, we also then can't have that within this group when it aims to give these people rights, when it aims to give these people the kind of recognition that they deserve. That is what we want to stand for as side opposition, right? So now allow me here to move on to the first issue, right? And here I speak about how we actually do not allow for how we actually hinge upon the progression of movements to even begin with. So what we get from side proposition is that we cannot have a collective umbrella, because when we have a collective umbrella, some people within that umbrella don't get to escape the rain, right? We tell you here, ladies and gentlemen, that it is better for us to sort of have this umbrella, because once people realize this umbrella, they can realize the different people standing under this umbrella, right? This is the kind of logic that we want to apply in this instance, and not just want to remove people from a group that is already gaining recognition, from a movement that is already showing that it is progressing, right? We tell you here that because this group is big in a moment, well, because this group is so huge, it has bigger agendas, it has a bigger agenda, and therefore it may take time for them to get through to each and every individual, but that doesn't mean that they don't actually do that, right? When they then fail to do that, we tell you that the transgender people under the LGBTI movement can hold it accountable when it does not grant them the rights that they need. Yes, sir.
That is why we consider that since 1968 it was important for them to stay within the bigger umbrella so that they can get that exposure, so that they get opportunity for people to know who they are. But at this certain point of time where we need to recognize nuance, it is important that they separate and they move away.
Thank you, sir. Just like how Korani tells you that right about now we cannot have this distinction. We can have it in the future when people have already warmed up to the fact that there's different people within society. There's different people who decide to identify themselves differently from society. Once society understands that there's different people, then they can understand the different people that they have within their society. We tell you that because this largely lies on the principle of identification, we need our society to first be warmed up to this idea of identification and then accept the people who decide to identify differently within our society. That's what we want as side opposition, right? But then also then tell you under this issue that as side opposition, we are better on the comparative because we then allow for radicalism to exist even in a more clearer aspect, right? We tell you the reason why #Fees Must Fall was such a huge thing in South Africa. It's not because only one university decided that fees must fall. It's because all these other universities decided to group themselves and fight for this very same cause. And then after that, we can then have roads must fall because we've already established this kind of premise that we need within our societies, right? We tell that because of the widespread benefits that exist, we need to allow these groups to exist coherently and then in the future have this kind of distinction. So now moving on to my second issue here, and here we tell you about the recognition of individuals, right? They tell us here that we can't necessarily have this recognition of individuals within the same group because they even separate in identity. Here's where the first speaker tells us that they're opposite in nature. Gender is something that you don't necessarily get oppressed to, right? Because it's something that people don't necessarily see as a kind of change. But then we tell you that the fact that people knew you as a girl when you were growing up, and now that you've changed into something, that is still a form of discrimination that you're going to receive from these people. Because we realize that transgender people don't need to necessarily only have toilets, but we first need people to identify that they are transgender people to even begin with, so that they give them these kind of privileges, right? Because we tell you that this is not on identification.
So what we needed to notice in today's debate is not only the transgender, but how the transgender received the best recognition in today's debate. And this is where we'll be analyzing today's debate and who wins on the marginal benefits that the transgender movement could actually receive, whether internally or externally on its own. So the first idea, is the society that we are looking at in today's debate. Because as much as this is about your self-identity, these movements fight against the society and the discriminations that these very societies have. So what do we then look at, right? We look at how do we then best deal with these very societies, right? And on proposition, what we're given is this radical movement, and how you have to be a transgender person on your own and fight these very people, or fight these very people within society. We tell you that no, Daniel, Akami's PRI still stands when she tells you of the 0.2% in society which voices are being more diluted if they stood on their own. We tell you it is better when you can fight them within that very system. We tell you when you can call out a gay person and say that, look, you are part of the LGBTQIA+ movement, but look at what you are doing. This does not go according to the movement. You need to recognize me. I have a 2% place within this very movement. We tell you that this is marginally better. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we told you about how conflict is seen within society itself. We told you when society sees that people within this very movement are not even together, that people within this very movement create binary distinctions on who's who and who associates with who. It means that the society in itself then says that, look, our perception is not wrong to say that we do not want to associate with a gay person if a transgender person can choose not to associate with them. We tell you that these clear distinctions which are made within society are something that would not even only harm the transgender movement, but that would harm all movements inherently. But on the second level, we look at the transgender movement in itself, right? And we look at how it would have existed on its own, or how it would have existed within the LGBTQIA+ movement, right? And we tell you that on the foundation level, we are already winning in today's debate. When we tell you that the discrimination which is set for both of these parties is because everybody is assigned with a cisgender at birth, is because everybody is assigned with a certain sexuality and told to love one person at birth and not being able to create that distinction at birth, that both of these groups come from that very same place, that both of these groups understand each other's struggle. But furthermore, we draw out the principles of feminism and how we have feminazis and how we have liberal feminisms and how these both exist within one very movement, even though they might be different. But furthermore, we told you that the voices are more heard when the voice is within this place. We tell you that the reason that we can ensure that toilets are there for transgender people is because we recognize that we've given the right to gay people, now it's their turn. We tell you that today is not a good day to do this. Tomorrow, yes, we might differentiate them, but right now we need to make sure that globally everybody recognizes that the people who are different need to be recognized.
Our goal today was never to get the oppressors to listen. The burden of the brutalized should never be to comfort the bystander. Our goal is to give the oppressed the opportunity to speak. And when you belong to a movement that has 24 other letters, a movement in which your voice is likely to be drowned out, you say that your ability to speak is being silenced. Ladies and gentlemen, we told you from the beginning that we care about individual power and accurate representation, and that is what we will continue to defend. 2 questions. Which scenario is likely to see trans people advocating their interests effectively? And secondly, what's better for social engagement? Under the first clash, they told us that you can simultaneously advocate for trans issues along with LGBT issues, right? They said that there are shared values and shared goals that exist between these movements. We say that in the instance in which there are shared values, they can collaborate on these issues. We think this became a moot point. But secondly, they failed to recognize the nuance of our argument, right? Because we never said that trans issues are ignored altogether within the collective umbrella movement. We told you that they get sidelined, that they get delayed, that the LGBT issues get prioritized more. Why should it be the case that trans people were given bathrooms only after marriage equality was achieved? We say that people need to be able to get their issues heard at the same time, and this can only happen when they exist independently. Because firstly, in a collective umbrella movement, you're likely going to be drowned out by leaders that set the agenda, and secondly, that capital gives people the sense of entitlement that their issues need to be taken care of. They told us here that you need access to this capital. You need access to this capital in order to thrive as a movement. We say that is why historically we were happy for them to remain amalgamated, because they got this kind of exposure, but now's the perfect time for them to be separate and to be independent. But most importantly, we can allow them to collaborate as allies. That it's much easier for you to call out someone when they're not seeking to improve your condition when you exist separately than when you do it in an amalgamated movement, because then you're easily sidelined. But we were even willing to take the hard line. We were even willing to take the hard line in the instance in which these movements become antagonistic, because we said that it shouldn't be the case that you need to be dependent on someone else for your struggles to be realized, which is why they need that safe space. They need that community. They need that opportunity to band together separate, which is something that we defend when it comes to women within the fight for racial equality or within the feminist movement. This was something that wasn't responded to and it wasn't interested in outcomes. They already lose. Second question, what's better for social engagement? Firstly, let's point out the contradiction here, where they said that it's bad when movements become separate because that encourages more discrimination in society, but they were willing to accept that this can happen in the future. A contradiction that needs to be pointed out there. But secondly, we say that the reason bigots are bigots is because they're bigots, not because they notice division within other groups, and that's something that's unlikely to change. What we do allow for on our side is for cross-movement critique, for people to not be afraid to criticize the transphobia that is endemic within the gay community because they're one movement and they need to think about the bigger picture. When they exist separately, that discourse is likely to happen. But secondly, that we need to recognize intersectionality, right? The only way society can actually understand the issues that people go through is if we acknowledge those issues for what they are. They're distinct, they're different, and they're nuanced. We want qualitative engagement in society. We don't want engagement for engagement's sake, something we're willing to defend. They didn't respond to media representation. We think that's enough for them to lose. Ladies and gentlemen,